I'm Liz VZ, and I'm Policy and Rural Energy Director at Solar United Neighbors, and have been working on issues around rural electric co-ops and working with member owners to help their co-ops better serve them for years now, more than 5 years, and excited to be continuing that work at Solar United Neighbors. And we have a really great group here tonight of folks from Colorado, Virginia, and Mississippi who are gonna help us better understand electric co-op governance and transparency and how rural electric co-ops or RECs can better serve their member owners. And so we'll talk some about legislation that's passed in Colorado. Holly's actually a board member at a co-op in Colorado and is going to talk about some of the great stuff they've done to engage their members and have transparency. And so I think that'll be really exciting. And then we'll hear more about Virginia and electric co-ops and some of the issues that member owners are dealing with there and in Mississippi. So yeah, I just want to encourage folks. If folks want to say where they're coming from, where they're, what co-op they're a member owner of, or where they're coming from, and introduce themselves quickly in the chat, I welcome folks to do that. You may just want to make sure that you're chatting to everyone instead of just the host and panelists. And let's see what else I can say. Oh, and then I encourage people to use the Q&A function to ask questions, and we will try to answer those during the webinar and then come back to some questions at the end. And we should have time at the end for questions. So I don't want to take up any more time. I want to send it over to our panel. I'm going to, Seth, I guess I'll let you just introduce yourself briefly. And yeah, kick us off.
All right, I'm going to start my timer here so I can keep track of where I am. Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining us. My name is Seth Heald. I'm a member owner of Rappahannock Electric Cooperative in Virginia and have been for going on about 13 years now. Democracy and transparency issues were apparent to me from the time I went to my first co-op annual meeting, which was about 10 or 11 years ago. At that meeting and afterwards, I started looking into the how the co-op was governed. And I learned the co-op did not disclose board pay. It didn't disclose financial statements or even the tallies of the votes in a board election. I worked with other people over the years, and I'm happy to say that my co-op now does disclose those things. But quite a few other co-ops in Virginia still don't. But while my co-op has made significant strides, it hasn't budged on two of the most important issues involving co-op transparency and democracy. And that is the board members' ability to control election outcomes. Through a proxy system that my co-op uses, it ends up controlling usually between 40 and 60% of all votes cast in every board election. And I did an analysis of the election tallies that I eventually did get for the last 12 years, 11 years. In every election, the person who got the board vote won. And in every election, the person who came in second would have won if that person had gotten the board votes. What that means is that my co-op, which serves 140,000 members, one of the largest co-ops in the country, the board is controlled by 9 people, and they choose their own successors. And I don't think that's right, and I don't think that's uncommon. I think from talking to other co-op members around Virginia, I think through the same sort of proxy system and other methods, co-op boards like to control the outcomes of elections. And I don't think a lot of our elected leaders are aware of that and fully appreciate that co-ops are not as democratic as they sometimes claim to be. when you have the board choosing its own members and choosing who stays on and who goes off, that can lead to groupthink. It can lead to board members staying on for decades. In our co-op, people have stayed on for over 40 years. I know that's happening at other co-ops in Virginia and around the country too. And it just kind of enforces a conformity that insulates the board from the members of the co-op. And it's a problem. The NRECA has issued a governance report that I'll put in the chat later, how you can find that online, that recommends against having boards control their own election outcomes. But in Virginia, at least some of the co-ops have not followed that recommendation. Just in our most recent election at my co-op in 2021, there was one candidate who got more than twice as many votes of members who actually selected a candidate than any of his competitors. It was a five-way race, but one guy was the clear winner among member owners voting. But the board controlled about, 39% of the vote. And they swung all those votes to the guy who came in fourth out of five among member owner votes. So that guy is now on the board. And that's kind of the way it works at my co-op, and I think at others too. Some co-ops, I know a neighboring co-op uses nominating committees to sort of select candidates and present them as the preferred choice. But I've heard that sometimes the nominating committees are just people that the board appoints who are friends or cronies of the board. So there's a need for, I think, legislatures to become more aware of how these subtle and not so subtle methods are used to control our electric utilities. And of course, electricity is a basic need. These businesses have monopoly jurisdiction over their territories. You don't have the choice of going to another utility unless you sell your house or move away, which many people don't want to do or can't do. Another way that boards make it hard, of co-ops make it hard to really have a democratic, fair election, is transparency. Now, I mentioned my co-op has improved in many areas of its transparency, but there's one area it won't budge on, and that is opening up board meetings so that members of the co-op can observe them. Not to speak at them, not to interrupt or delay, simply to observe and see what their elected and well-paid board members do. Again, the NRECA task force recommends that that's a good practice. There are pros and cons, as there are with anything, but on balance, the task force recommended doing that. And it's really important because in most co-op elections that I've seen, when the time comes to vote, they give very little information about who to vote for. You get a little short bio that often just tells where someone lives, how many children or grandchildren they have, and other, what church they go to, all of which is nice to know, but you'd really like to know more about what do they know about this co-op if they've been on it for its board for 30 years. What have they learned? What do they see as the issues challenging us? And what's really needed is transparency, where you can attend board meetings and see if the incumbents are doing a good job. They all say they are, and they should be happy to show us that they are, but also to have some sort of forum where during the election season, the board candidates don't just read a rehearsed speech or have a short bio, but actually face the members and can answer questions and have questions posed to them. And then you might see how prepared they are, whether they're really the best person of the candidates on the ballot to serve our co-op for the next 3 years or whatever the term is. As far as voting, it's the proxy process that really is a problem. And there was a reason for that maybe back in the old days when co-ops first started. But in today's modern world, you can have just direct voting for candidates with mail and online. There's no reason to insert boards in there to give their views and give them control. And I think Joe will talk later about how in Colorado, and I know this is true in South Carolina too, state legislatures have acted to just require those direct elections. Another thing I wanted to mention is lobbying. Electric co-ops, like a lot of utilities, do lobbying at the state, federal, and even local level. but we never hear what their positions are, or rarely do. In Virginia, Cooperative Living magazine is the largest circulation publication in Virginia. It's co-ops have a part of their principles is to educate their members, but I've never seen anything in there about their lobbying positions. And this came to our attention a year or so ago when the Virginia co-ops signed on to a letter to our governor and legislators, and they were opposed to having a minimum wage apply to domestic workers, people who work in other people's homes, and also opposed to funding for flood preparedness. And I remember seeing that and thinking, why are they taking a position on this? This really is not something that they really have a business taking it. And they have domestic workers among their member owners. But even worse, they don't tell their member owners that they've done this. And so if they did tell them, then democracy might work better. People might then be able to talk to their board members, maybe vote them out of office if they don't have a good explanation for why they're doing that. So disclosure of lobbying positions and how much money is spent on lobbying is really essential. So there's too much secrecy. Just want to conclude by saying, if you want to learn more or learn how you can help here in Virginia, you can email us at info@repowerrec.com. I'll put that in the chat. And with that, I'll turn it back to you, Liz.
Great, thanks, Seth. Good job staying on time. Now I'm going to turn it over to Joe Smyth, who has done a lot of work tracking electric co-ops and governance and transparency and clean energy stuff through his cleancooperative.com blog, and now works at Energy and Policy Institute on some of these issues. So I'll let Joe take it away.
Great, thanks, Liz, and thanks for that information about what's going on in Virginia, Seth. I'm going to talk a little bit about the progress that's been made to ensure certain minimum transparency and governance rules for electric cooperatives in Colorado. It's a process that's gone on for about the last decade here in the state, led by co-op reform advocates, co-op ratepayers, and also forward-thinking co-op directors, staff, to help ensure that co-ops are staying true to the principles of democratic, transparent operation here in Colorado. So maybe useful to zoom back a little bit. I'm a member of an electric cooperative. For those of you who are joining us today who are also members of electric cooperatives, that means you own your utility, right? Along with thousands of other neighbors of yours in the region. You own the utility. And so you might then have some questions about how the utility that you own is operating, right? Is it still relying on coal? Is it cleaning up its power supply? Does it have programs to help members electrify or insulate their homes? Are its rates fair? Is it paying for lobbyists trying to weaken clean energy policies in the state or federal government? How does it treat members that want to invest in rooftop solar? And many other questions, right? And that's why transparency is so critical for understanding what the utility that you own is doing and how it's making decisions, how the board operates, what kind of information that they're relying on to make those decisions. That can be sometimes challenging to get that information. Seth had some other examples, and I've heard other stories too from other regions of the country where some co-ops seem to operate mostly behind closed doors and not sharing a lot of information with their members and the public. Other co-ops, I think, are leading on this and taking proactive steps to make sure that they're doing what they can to inform the membership about why they're making decisions, what's at stake, and where the co-op is headed. The efforts in Colorado, I think, have centered around making sure that, while there's going to be a variation in how the different co-ops operate, of course, there should be some basic minimum standards to ensure that kind of transparency so members know what's going on. So I thought I'd go through, some of the key rules. The first bill was passed just about a decade ago in 2010 in response to some of the same concerns that Seth was detailing in Virginia around co-ops that seem to try and prevent folks from effectively running for the board and operating a fair election. So one of those rules is centered around monthly board meetings. So in Colorado, every co-op monthly board meeting, that's open to the ratepayers and to the news media so that we can see what's going on. Ratepayers, co-op members are also entitled to an opportunity to raise any concerns, typically at the beginning of a board meeting. And co-ops also have to post an agenda 10 days ahead of the meeting to make sure folks have an opportunity to see what's going to be discussed at the meeting. And also have to publish board meeting minutes from each of those meetings once they're approved, typically a month after the meeting. So that's a way that folks can either attend in person or at least get a summary of what happened at that meeting to check on what's going on at the co-op. There's also rules for co-ops in Colorado around rates and financial audits. So new this year, all co-ops, and I think most of them are already doing this, but now co-ops in Colorado need to publish information about their rates and their net metering policies on their website. And if a member requests, they are entitled to receive any financial audits that have been completed about the co-op in the last 3 years. So that's an opportunity for folks to, see what the rates are, make sure that they're consistent with good rate design practices, or challenge them if they're not, and see what kind of financial audits have been done on the co-op as well. There's also a series of rules around co-op elections. Any member of the co-op can run for the board by gathering 15 signatures. So in other areas, sometimes those restrictions, really high bars that serve as the deterrent for competitive elections. But in Colorado, there's a rule that makes sure that, you have to do some work. You got to get 15 signatures from other co-op members. But if you do that and they're approved as co-op members, you can run for the board of directors. Co-ops are also required to publish information about the election policies they have on their website. And they're supposed to do that a certain few months in advance of the election. So people have an opportunity to see how's this election going to work, what's the timeline, that sort of thing. Members can also vote by mail or in attendance at the annual meeting. And candidates for the board can observe the counting of the ballots to make sure that it's done in a upfront, transparent way. And proxy voting is strictly prohibited. So it's one member, one vote, and that's how we run our elections here, right? There's also rules about boards of directors once a board is elected, right? All Colorado co-ops are supposed to publish contact information for the board of directors. So if you as a member have a concern about what's going on at the co-op, you can find out who your representative is on the board and send them an email or write them a letter to express those concerns if you can't make it to the board meeting today. There's also some guidelines around conflicts of interest, right? In cases where a director might have a financial stake in a company that could be contracting with the co-op or those sorts of things. There's guidelines to make sure that co-ops have policies to address that sort of situation. There's also rules about if a co-op director also sits on the board of directors of a generation transmission association, to make sure that it's clear to those directors that they have a fiduciary duty to the co-op that they serve on and the Generation Transmission Association. There have been some issues in the past around the G&T asserting to those directors that they owe a fiduciary duty really to the G&T ahead of the co-op. And this rule makes sure that they're not pressured, or at least it helps avoid pressure from the G&T to just go along with what management of the G&T wants. There's a few other rules, but I think I'll pause there and maybe just zoom out. One of the key changes that was just made this year, a new law that expanded some of those transparency rules and added a few other ones. But the main expansion was to ensure that the existing transparency rules that exist for co-ops in Colorado now also apply to the Generation Transmission Association. So Generation Transmission Associations are the wholesale power providers that sell power to the electric cooperatives that then distribute that electricity to the homes and businesses in their service territories. And by and large, these are much larger entities. They operate huge power plants, often coal-fired power plants, and historically have received very little scrutiny, and I typically don't open their board meetings. This key rule makes sure that our G&T now is subject to some of those same transparency rules the other co-ops have been complying with for the last decade. And I think that'll help ensure that as co-ops in Colorado begin this transition away from coal to a more renewable and decentralized energy system, that we'll have better access to the information about how those decisions are being made and why. So I'll pause there and send it back to Liz.
Great, thanks, Joe. That was a good overview and right on time also. Thanks for that. And next we're gonna go to Benita down in Mississippi. Benita works at Southern Echo, I think, on all kinds of things. She's technically the chief financial officer, but can do all kinds of things and is very talented. And she's been working for years on rural electric co-op reform and member owner organizing in Mississippi. And she's also co-chair of the Advancing Equity and Opportunity Collaboratives, Democratizing Rural Electric Co-ops Working Group. That's quite a mouthful, but I think I got that all in. And yeah, really glad to have Bonita here. I'll pass it to her.
Thank you, everyone. Nice to meet everyone, Joe and Seth and Liz and Aaron, Holly. Thank y'all so much, and everyone listening out there. Hello from the hospitality state. You know, and I listening to Joe and Seth, and just wishing that my story was going to be different than theirs. But I can echo a lot of the issues that they are speaking about, especially when we start talking about the 7 cooperative principles. Muted myself. When I think about the 7 cooperative principles, I think about democratic participation, the need for, you know, of course, the economic participation on behalf of the member owners, concern for community. There's so many things that pop in my mind. And then when I look around the rural parts of the state and I see just the landscape, you know, our young people are leaving. There's no economic development. We call electric cooperatives the good old boys club because they kind of all work together. We have 26 electric cooperatives in the state, collectively worth over $1 billion. Mind you, Mississippi is one of the poorest states in the nation. We also have electric cooperatives in Mississippi serve 98% persistent poverty counties in Mississippi. So that's astounding. When you think about why they were founded. And so some of the examples I like to give when we're talking about governance and transparency. First of all, I always like to talk about where it hits people most, their pocketbook, right? We talk about, you know, them being 501c12s. You know, we have the Public Service Commission on the state level that can regulate them. In Mississippi, the only thing that the Public Service Commission can do to regulate an electric cooperative, the only thing they can approve are service areas. They have no ability to approve any change in kilowatt rates or anything like that. They cannot help when it comes to issues of complaints of member owners against the electric cooperative. It is purely, they are just there to approve or not approve service areas for the electric cooperative, which can create a lot of issues. One of the public service commissioners who is no longer a commissioner now, he sued his electric cooperative because they had not had an election in 71 years. I was able to I am a CFO, so I did a financial analysis of all of the electric cooperatives in the state of Mississippi, just to kind of see where they were spending their money. Because number one, they're not telling their member owners how they're spending the money that they are bringing in. And they're spending it on things such as buying a golf course that the people of color in the community cannot become members of. You would think in 2021 that this would not be an issue, but it very much is. So for example, with Twin County, the average income for that service area is around $27,000. That's the average income. Now we have office managers for the electric cooperative making around $115,000. And when you look at the 990, that's where I always start. You see a lot of them are family members. They are friends. The contractors are, as long as they're under $100,000, they do not have to divulge who are the contractors that they're paying to. But a lot of them, when I've researched the companies, I'm a former state auditor. When I research who the companies are, they're owned by family members or children of member owner of the board of directors. I'm going to drop a link in the chat. Here we go. As soon as I figure out how. There we go. There was an attempt in 1984 by a young woman by the name of Alita Fitzgerald and Steve Suits in order to democratize the board of directors of a particular co-op in Mississippi. They did organizing for months. And when the board of directors saw hundreds of Black people come out to vote, they didn't want to vote via proxy ballot. They wanted to vote in person. When the board saw all these Black and brown people outside in the parking lot, one of the board of directors disappeared. He got sick. And about 2 weeks later, all of the incumbents were reelected for another 3 years behind closed doors. So when we think about like federal elections, we think about how they suppress the vote. In Mississippi, they do the same thing when it comes to even elected cooperative elections. So we are allowed to vote via proxy ballot in Mississippi. Is either proxy ballot or in person, and your in-person vote supersedes your proxy ballot. However, a lot of the times, we're talking about communities and member owners who are on fixed incomes, they're underemployed, and whatever they can do to save some money, they're going to do. So when you receive a proxy ballot that says, hey, sign your name and mail it back, and we'll take $100 off your electricity bill, what would you do? Are you going to say, no, I'm just going to write in my own candidate, or I'm going to run my own candidate? No, you're going to sign your name, mail it back in, not worry about attending that annual meeting and seeing who your board of directors are, seeing what they're doing on your behalf, how they're representing your voice, right? One thing that always bothers me is that the annual meetings are usually in the middle of the day on a weekday, when a lot of our people are at work and cannot get off. And if you're late, 1 minute late, they will lock the door on you. You will not be allowed in. So it's just a lot of different things like that. I'm going to, this time really, there it is. I just dropped in the chat an article to that 1984 case with Alita Fitzgerald and Steve Suits. You'll see that as well. I also want to talk about just, again, the economic participation of the member owners. They have these things called capital credits, or patronage capital that we talk about. We had electric cooperative here in Mississippi that had never given any type of credits back since the 1930s, never given anything back. And when they did do it in 2015, they did it for member owners between 1940 and 1989. I'm going to ask you, when you think about Mississippi, who were member owners? Who owned land? Who was able to pay their own, their own electricity bill? They were not people of color. And so they gave around $26 million in capital credits and patronage capital back to member owners. Very few of them were people of color. But the area that the service area that they were covering was around 67% African American now. So you think about the inequities there, what people are giving up. I call the loss of opportunity, the opportunity cost. What people are giving up in order to keep their lights on. We talk about transparency and governance, and I always talk about accountability. Because if you're talking about concern for community, there is no way that our people should have to not purchase insulin in order to keep the lights on, because they have bills of $700, $800. And then the reconnect fee could be $1,000. We have electric cooperative here in Mississippi and called Magnolia EPA. They actually have prepaid electricity. You can buy $10 worth of electricity. And if you do not get back and purchase more electricity before your money is used up, you get a disconnect fee, and they do not consider you a member owner, which goes against the bylaws. There are a lot of things, and I may be running out of time, Liz. I'm not sure if I am, but I have a lot of other examples, and if we have some more time, I would love to share some more of my experiences. Thank you, Liz.
Thanks, Benita. That was right on time. That was perfect. And I feel like I, learn new things every time, but I'm always like, wow, there's a lot of work to be done when I hear some of those stories. But thanks, Benita, for being here and sharing that. And now, on a happier note, we have someone who is on a board, who actually has open board meetings. It's amazing. And I'm excited to pass it along to Holly Metzler, who I worked with when I was working at We Own It. She was a fellow, and she worked really hard to get herself elected to the board, and is going to tell us more about La Plata Electric Association, LPEA, in Colorado, where she's now a board member. Very exciting.
Great, thank you, Liz. And thank you, Benita, for sharing your story. I think we all need to hear that. And I've heard things like that similar before, but I just want to acknowledge that. So hello, everybody. My name is Holly Leanne Metzler, and I'm really honored and privileged to be here tonight to talk to you about something that has become one of my favorite topics of discussion, and that's La Plata Electric Association. I want to extend my gratitude to Liz and Solar United and all my fellow panelists for being here this evening. But I want to extend an even bigger thank you to all of our audience members who are here tonight, because it's with your participation that our cooperative communities are going to become healthier and stronger and more resilient. So before I get going, I'd like to say that everything I say tonight is of my own opinion and does not represent the position of the board of directors of LPEA unless I specifically state such. That is a transparency issue the board has been working on most recently in order to be able to allow individual directors such as myself to be able to discuss topics without undermining the overall collective board decision-making process of LPEA board of directors. I was elected to this board of directors in May 2019. And ever since then, I have become more appreciative of the qualities of this organization and the leadership behind it. Before my tenure on this board, there was a lot of turbulence in the membership. We had one side who was highly invested in seeking more local control of our electricity generation resources, as well as a cleaner energy source than our generation and transmission provider was supplying to us. And on the other side, we had folks arguing that we have had reliable and affordable energy for 80 years, and why should we mess with that? So we have very sought after board seats. We have a lot of candidates. We have a lot of support for candidates on specific positions, and we have a whole lot of contested elections. Currently, our vote tally every year is around 25%, probably give or take 3%. That's not an easy road. All that turbulence is not often easy for folks, but one of the great benefits I think that came out of it was incredible transparency of LPEA's affairs. Even today, we talk all the time about, in every single meeting, about how to increase transparency and how to be able to get information into our member owners' hands. When I joined the LPEA board in May of 2019, the LPEA board was already live streaming all of the monthly board meetings, and they were putting recordings on the website for member owners to be able to access. For the first couple of months, it was really pretty interesting because we'd get metrics on how many people from what area of the country were watching our board meetings for how long and what segment, and it was really pretty interesting. I'm actually a scientist at heart, and I like that stuff. Now with Zoom meetings, it's pretty easy to see who is at our board meetings. We always have member owners there, and a lot of times we'll have several of them make it to the very end of the board meeting, including members of our local press. So that's pretty exciting. All of our meetings, including all of our committee meetings, are live broadcast and recorded for future consumption. In the late summer of 2019, I was able to go to 6 days of classes with the National Rural Electric Cooperative Association. And there I was able to achieve my credentialed cooperative director certification. While I was there at that time, I was able to meet directors from all over the country. And it was pretty apparent from early on that LPEA's practice of live broadcasting our meetings was unheard of. And about half of the board meeting directors that I talked to did not have open board meetings. At LPEA, every single board meeting starts with an hour of member owner comments and concerns, if we have them. In 28 board meetings, I've only had 2 board meetings where we did not have member owner comments and concerns. And to tell you the truth, that part of the meeting is my absolute favorite piece of the whole meeting, and it's a great way to start the day. LPA has some other tactics we use to increase transparency and inform our member owners. We do not have any email advocation of positions. It's very important that our discussions are held in a public forum where the public can see and participate. So if we do email directors back and forth, it's only to clarify information or to trade information. You can never advocate for a position via email. Our executive sessions are very important to be able to discuss strategic things, and sensitive information can be revealed there. But all information is better to be held in the public forum where we can. When we go into executive session, we will do it by motion. A motion has to pass by 2/3 vote, and we will, in that motion, it has to indicate what that executive session is going to cover. LPEA has recently started a practice over some of the topics where we will have a short public presentation of that executive session topic before we go into executive session, with all of the vital information redacted, just so that we can help keep the public as far in the loop as we can without revealing our strategy going forward. When we come out of executive session, there will always be a motion to act on something that was discussed or a declaration of no action. So community engagement is also super important at LPEA. Last week, we had 2 really well-attended member owner appreciation luncheons. And at this, we were able to distribute information on rebates, on energy conservation, while we signed people up to for a drawing to win an electric lawnmower. On October 6th, we will have a virtual business meeting, which all member owners have been invited to. And towards the end of October, we will have 2 virtual town halls. And the topic to be discussed is bringing our member owners up to speed on the work that we have been doing to evaluate our best options going forward on our power supply. So I'm really looking forward to that as well. I'd like to leave you at this time with a visual cue. Liz, if you don't mind, would you put up the most recent resource page that we added to the LPEA website?
Yeah, give me a sec, but I'll pull it up.
All right, great. Okay, great. Thank you. Yep, that's it. So one of our directors was really, can you scroll up just a little bit, please? He was really concerned about how would our member owners be able to access the resolutions that we were voting on in our board meeting. And so our staff immediately kicked into gear, and within a week they had this handy table that is on our website, and it has links to all the meeting agendas. It has links to the approved minutes, to the video, to any resolutions that were passed, and sometimes other information. You'll see September tri-state report, for instance. A lot of the times that tri-state's our generation and transmission provider. So in conclusion, transparency is something that has to be taken both at the individual level as well as the organizational level. And if we are able to adequately address transparency and keep things in the open, it also helps mitigate risk. So that's all I have for you at this point in time. I included a link to that resource page on the LPEA website for your perusal, and I'll be happy to take any questions.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Holly. That was really great. Yeah, and I know that Holly didn't want to dig into this, but she mentioned those upcoming town halls, and LPEA and some of the other co-ops in Colorado have really pushed the conversation around generation and transmission co-ops, and what does it cost to leave, and we're interested in leaving, and that's been a big long conversation in Colorado that would take a whole nother webinar or two. But I think it's just important to raise that there are co-ops, and we're learning about more and more co-ops every day that are asking those questions publicly and pushing the envelope. I know we have some folks from Minnesota. Connexus Energy, the largest co-op in Minnesota, is also has publicly announced they're considering leaving their generation and transmission co-op, Great River Energy. So just something that I think is starting to get a lot of attention. But that was really awesome. Thanks everyone for your remarks, and hopefully we'll get some good questions start rolling in. We've only had a couple so far in the chat and the Q&A, but maybe we'll have some more come in. And then I just wanted to mention, I guess I didn't mention at the beginning, that the organization I work for, Solar United Neighbors, works to bring people together, go solar, and fight for their energy rights. So we work on solar co-ops, but also on stuff like utility accountability and helping people get more involved in making their utilities better, like we're doing here. And we're in Virginia, we're a coalition of a group, including some member owner-led groups like RepowerREC and SVEC, standing for Shenandoah Valley Electric Co-op Check. So a group of member owners from SVEC, along with Appalachian Voices, Virginia Organizing, Piedmont Environmental Council, and the Virginia Sierra Club. So we are working on a campaign and encouraging people to take action and tell their legislators that we need to have open board meetings in Virginia. So I'm going to put some more information about that in the chat now before I forget, and then I'll circle back at the end, but want to open it up. I know, Sean, you have raised your hand a couple of times, and I know Sean is a member owner at Shenandoah Valley. So I think I'm going to allow him to ask a question if he has one. He just disappeared on my list. So maybe, oh, I guess he was raising his hand by accident. So no worries, Sean. I thought you had a really burning question. I see a question about the recording being available, and yes, the recording will be available. I don't know if anybody wants to start us off. Seth, you had a good question to maybe start off with, and then I'll be able to read through a bunch of the questions that just came in. But I think your, or there was a question that we thought we'd start off with around, are there congressional or federal level regulations or laws that would address any of these issues? Do you want to take that?
And I know my co-op, and I probably many others, claim they don't really need to have totally fair elections or full transparency in their board meetings because they say they're regulated. And of course, the level of state regulation varies a lot from state to state. In Virginia, there is some regulation of rates, but there's no regulation in Virginia on things like fair election practices, board transparency, board pay. The boards set their own pay. The only way to regulate that is for member owners to be fully informed about it and have fair elections to vote for candidates who are in agreement with their view of what board pay should be. At the federal level, the House and Senate Agriculture Committees have some ability to hold hearings on electric co-ops, and about 10 years or so ago, they held a major hearing in the House of Representatives after irregularities surfaced at a co-op in Texas and another one in Georgia and maybe a few others. I'm not aware that there's been a major hearing since then, and I think there really is a need for our legislators at the state and federal level to pay more attention and to listen to the stories from people around the country. The Internal Revenue Service reviews tax exempt status. Electric co-ops are tax exempt nonprofits. To be tax exempt, they basically have to really be operating as a cooperative, which means they should be complying with all of the 7 cooperative principles, including genuine democratic control. But it's kind of an barely hid secret that the IRS has had very little resources to audit and review nonprofits, the nonprofit sector as a whole. So I'm not aware of the IRS having used its authority to look into cooperatives where there are issues, serious issues that call into question whether they really are democratically controlled. I see there are a lot more questions, Liz, so I'll turn it back to you.
Okay, thanks, Seth. That was great. I don't know if I've been able to read all the questions, but I sifted through many of them. And just a reminder to folks that if you want everybody to see your chat, make sure you are sending it to everyone. Also, there was a question around what are the, for a typical closed club or rural electric co-op, what are the first steps in bringing transparency that a small group of member owners can take? I don't know if anyone of the panelists wants to take a shot at that.
Well, I can start with something. Education, being informed and engaged. That's where it starts. Because, I don't know if it's Seth or Joe who spoke about how member owners don't know that they're member owners, number one. So once you are armed with that knowledge, you have that knowledge, then you can do more. And so for me, the foundation to everything is going to be knowledge, and then after that, engagement. So I think Seth was going to say something.
Yeah, you really have to get together with your fellow member owners, and you have to do some homework. I've talked to people at other Virginia co-ops who are upset about various aspects of their co-op's operation, but don't seem to have looked at the bylaws and looked at the election practices. And sometimes that's hard because, as I mentioned, our co-op didn't used to even reveal the election tallies. And I know a number of other Virginia co-ops don't. It was only after we got those at my co-op that we began to realize how the board controls election outcomes. So you need to study and spread the word among your fellow member owners as to how the board operates, which means a thorough reading of the bylaws and then going to annual meetings. But then once you've gotten past that, it really is getting member owners together. But even there are limits. If the board elections are not fair, there's only so much you can do. But you could ask for legislation. You could go to your legislators, state and federal. I saw that Dr. Walden, who I know is on from Georgia, is contacting someone she knows in the White House. So I think the story needs to get out more about how, and of course, it's not every co-op. Some co-ops don't have these issues, but it's time for legislators at the state and federal level to take a look at this more closely, and in this day and age, make sure that co-ops really are genuinely democratic.
Thanks, Seth. Yeah, and I think, we've seen at a lot of co-ops, including Rappahannock, where Seth and RepowerREC and folks who are here have been working, and at Powell Valley, Electric Co-op in Tennessee and Virginia, where some of the folks here might also be working, getting more involved and asking questions and pushing has helped change the conversation and helped, move the needle. And there are things like Seth mentioned, and maybe he mentioned again, but maybe you want to drop that link in the chat again, Seth, to the governance report. I think that's a great reference coming from the National Rural Electric Co-op Association that has recommendations for doing many of these things. Can also help too. But yeah, sometimes just bringing to light and education the conversation can help change things. Just working on typing an answer. Let's see. Do you all have questions that you see in the chat you want to answer?
Yeah, I see a question about Virginia legislation from Sue Mastel. There are a group of people working at the moment to try to get some legislation in Virginia that would deal specifically with three of the what we think are the most serious issues, which are the use of proxy voting to have the board control election outcomes. Our law would deal with that, and lobbying disclosure, another issue that I mentioned, and then board transparency. It's worth pointing out here that I know the co-ops do a lot of lobbying. Every year in January, they take all their board members down to Richmond, stay in a nice hotel for a night or two, go out to dinner, and then they take them around to legislators' offices and they all talk about how democratic they are. So the legislators are hearing that side of the story, and they don't often hear that isn't always quite the case. And so we need to build support so that more legislators can see the true picture. So I'm assuming you're in Virginia, Sue. So if so, I put my email address down, info@repowerrec.com. I'd love to have you get in touch, and maybe we could talk about the situation at your co-op.
Hey, this is Aaron. I'm Liz's colleague at Solar United Neighbors, and thank you all the panelists. It's been a really excellent discussion. I actually just had maybe a point or an observation based on what Joe mentioned, and that was the point where electric or distribution cooperatives can have some interests by sitting on their generation and transmission cooperative or suppliers board. And for example, here in Virginia, I believe 11 of the 13 cooperatives have signed long-term energy supply agreement with ODEC, Old Dominion Electric Cooperative, until 2054. And they have I believe their president and one board member sits on ODEC's board. And I think, I'm curious as to how do we determine, or you mentioned, Joe, that there is a law requiring that there's some sort of accountability in the generation and transmission cooperatives board. How do we determine if they're actually serving the long-term interests of their energy supplier, or they're actually serving the interests of their distribution co-ops? I don't know if you have anything. It's kind of, and I'll give you an example. What we've seen in Virginia is a lot of the electric cooperatives, or many of them, are raising their fixed access charge. So for example, Shenandoah Valley Electric Cooperative has, in the last 2 years, more than doubled their basic access charge from $13, and now they're proposing $30. So I mean, to me, that seems like they're really doing the bidding of their generation supplier. So again, the question is how do we determine that, or is there a way that we can really unpack that? And you're on mute, Joe.
Oh, Joe, are you?
Thanks. I can take a stab at that one. That's a really good question. Thanks, Aaron. I mean, I think the state of affairs that has existed between distribution cooperatives and their wholesale power providers is basically based on outdated conceptions of an energy system of the past. And the idea that the G&T is governed by representatives of the distribution cooperative perhaps worked in a time when the utility system was a much simpler, entirely centralized generation model. As we get into a future that is increasingly decentralized and renewable, where an electric cooperative now has an ability to be buying power from its own members rather than a wholesale power provider, it completely changes that dynamic, and that structure, relying on oversight of representatives of the distribution cooperatives to chart a future for the G&T, doesn't work very well anymore. And figuring out how we change that into something that takes into account the realities of our energy system today is pretty challenging. I think the first step is transparency on how the Generation Transmission Association is operating, how the decisions are being made. And then from there, we can start to figure out what does a good process look like.
Thank you. That's a great answer.
Anybody else want to weigh in on that?
I was going to weigh in on Kim Alexander's question, unless someone wants to weigh in on that again. Kim is out in Iowa, and he's saying, is there a downside to pushing for co-ops to merge with neighboring co-ops? In other words, to consolidate. And I know Virginia has 9 co-ops. It used to have a lot more, and they have merged. My own co-op is the result of a merger a number of years ago between 2 co-ops that dated themselves back to the original New Deal co-ops in the 1930s. There certainly are economies of scale that come with larger co-ops. You don't have to pay so many board salaries, so many CEO salaries, and many other economies of scale. On the other hand, if you have a really working co-op structure, it becomes harder to sustain without more effort the bigger you get. But I think I heard that in Iowa, practically every county has its own electric co-op, and that seems really absurdly too small to run an electric system. I don't know if the other panelists have any thoughts on that, but seems to me if you're in a really small co-op and you think that your prices, your rates are really high, merging with one or more other co-ops might well be a good idea. Well, someone pointed out the question about media, and I think that's great. I mean, what an example of transparency. In Virginia, the media is always covering Dominion Energy and everything it does. But because the co-ops are out in rural areas where there are fewer television reporters and daily paper reporters, a lot of the local coverage we see is the newspapers just printing press releases that the co-ops give them. So if the co-ops select some board members, they just say, well, these people won. They don't give the vote totals because the co-ops don't give them the vote totals, and the reporters don't think to ask. So I think all of us on the panel, other than Holly, are very jealous of Holly for the fact that she's at a co-op that has such forward-thinking views, and as she said, it works well, and I'm just in awe that you have that kind of transparency, and I hope you will continue to tell other co-op leaders as you meet them about, it doesn't have to be the way it is at a lot of our co-ops where the boards do everything in secret.
Yeah, thanks, Seth. We're about out of time. I think if we continue to have, it seems like there's more great questions coming in. So I think if folks can stay a few more minutes, we'll try to keep answering a few more questions. And I'll paste in again more info and where to take action around our campaign to get legislation in Virginia on these issues, similar to the legislation that passed in Colorado that we heard about tonight. And I think there was another question in the chat about other states. And
is that Sue Mastel's question that you see there? Sue Mastel had a question about, is Virginia unique in having separate legislation addressed to investor-owned utilities and electric co-ops? No, I don't think so. There's every state has, or almost every state, I think, has specific laws that apply to electric cooperatives. They also have some laws that may apply to both, but cooperatives are a significantly different form of business, and so it's not uncommon to have separate laws governing how they operate.
Yeah, most states have statutes that address, and maybe Benita, you were going to say the same thing, but
no, I was actually just gonna, I actually was gonna say something similar and just kind of piggyback off of Seth. The Rural Electrification Act gave authority to the public service commissions in each individual state to regulate utilities, right? So that includes, so for Mississippi, we have a particular department for IOUs, and then we have a particular department for the electric cooperatives and the munis. So we do keep those things separate, but there are specific codes for each and every one.
Yeah, and most states have some sort of statute, so state law that lays out, what is an electric co-op and any sort of laws related to electric co-ops. And so Colorado's has been updated to include these pieces around open board meetings and notification about board meetings and access to elections and the things that Joe was talking about earlier. And in terms of other states with laws similar to what passed in Colorado, South Carolina, there was corruption overturned at a co-op where the board members were sort of paying themselves an excessive salaries. And that led to legislation passing in South Carolina requiring transparency and some good governance.
Liz, I could maybe also add one thing in practice as well, although there's different legislation that's applied to co-ops and investor-owned utilities like a Dominion Energy. In practice, a lot of the co-ops will use the term or use the phrase that they are member-owned democratic entities to write themselves out of legislation. And unfortunately, through this forum, what we've seen is unfortunately that's not the case with the proxy ballot and closed board meetings. But in practice, that is something that they use for a type of hands-off approach to regulation. At least I've seen that in Virginia.
I guess I'd like to ask Holly a question about the NRECA governance report. Is that something that everybody at your co-op has read and paid attention to?
No, Seth, I wish I could tell you that this board spent a little more time working on the NRECA resolutions process and whatnot. That is actually in my jurisdiction. I am the LPA. I am actually the LPA representative to the NRECA resolutions process going on right now. But I'm still learning. I learned so much virtually every day and every week, and it's just been a total process. But did that roundabout answer your question, sir?
Yeah, thank you. I have another question for you, if you don't mind. Given all the transparency that your co-op has, what does it do when there's a contested board election to help member owners get enough information that they can cast an informed vote? Are there any forums where the candidates, the incumbent and the challenger, have to address questions that are put to them by the membership, or have to debate with each other? Do you do anything like that?
Well, the cooperative itself actually does something very similar to what you described. They take a short bio written by the candidate themselves and publish it. That's pretty close to the extent of what the cooperative itself does. Now, we have very active groups in the area that will hold discussions or debates. I was invited to about 4 of them myself and participated in 4 during my election cycle. So it's, pretty common to have that kind of a format in order to be able to get the candidates' particular views on the table.
And so people can ask questions of each candidate and to compare the answers from the different candidates? Yes,
but that's not a given, sir.
Yeah.
So some years it'll be a better, participation and better organizing for that kind of a venue. And some years it's not as, clear cut.
I know that down in Texas, at least I haven't checked lately, but Pedernales, the nation's largest co-op, I believe used to have at least 1 and maybe 2 or 3 forums held in an auditorium where people could come and ask questions. And that way the board members, the incumbents who've been on for decades, have to talk and answer. And if they don't show they're knowledgeable about what's happening at their co-op, and you have a challenger who does, people get to see that. And I've always wondered why we don't see more of that, but I'm glad that at least you have some other organizations that do that where you are.
Cool. Yeah. And for folks who don't know, Pedernales in Texas, as Seth said, one of the largest co-op, electric co-op in the country. It's outside of Austin. Member owners there overturned a bunch of corruption and then elected a whole new slate of reform board members who then led to these reforms like Seth was talking about. And that's how they ended up with forums. And they have a member bill of rights, and they have bylaws that were, you know, and they live stream their meetings like LPEA does. And so a lot of that came from member owner outrage and engagement there. We've got some questions. Benita, you had a question next, I think.
Actually two, but they'll be short, and they're actually for Holly. The first one, I was able to attend as a part of a delegation, the NRECA annual meeting in New Orleans, February of last year, before the pandemic. I'm sorry, y'all, my dog hears me and he's outside my bedroom door and he is not happy. And in one of the sessions, they were talking about transparency. And one of the panelists was she was in PR, and her response to the board of directors, just her advice was to give the appearance of being transparent. You don't have to be transparent. You just have to appear to be. And for me as an auditor, you know, that stands out to me. Taking your hat off as a board of director, how would you interpret that? I mean, for me, that was very disheartening to hear that to a room of hundreds of board of director members.
On a personal level, I would be downright offended.
Yeah.
You know, these are democratic institutions where we're supposed to encourage our member owners to participate. You know, it's really in the long run, mitigation of risk, right? If our member owners are participating and they're taking part of the process, then our board of directors also understands more about what our membership needs and wants. So if they're not paying attention to what the people need, they're going to leave themselves open to things like community choice aggregation and other bigger challenges. You know, if the cooperative model is being properly executed and all 7 cooperative principles are in play, where we are concerning about the community, we are doing democratic control, we are all financially participating, we all are doing cooperative principle 5 is one of my favorite, training, education, and information for all. You know, if we're all firing on all those cylinders, the cooperative model is really hard to beat, but it becomes difficult when and I think that, you know, you've nailed it on the head. In my personal opinion, it's the lack of diversity on our boards of directors that is creating these gigantic risks, both to the cooperatives at their individual levels, but also at our state and national levels. You know, they don't have the diversity of thought and education and whatever it takes to be able to see the risks coming down the pipeline.
Yeah, most definitely. I can definitely see it's kind of like the haves versus the have-nots. It's very expensive to be poor. It's like one of the things I like to say when I do community meetings. One last question, more advice, I guess, for member owners and organizers, especially in the South and especially in Mississippi, who have tried to run campaigns, tried to diversify the board, tried to educate the community. And, you know, we just kind of keep just bumping our heads up against the wall. Do you have any advice on how the member owners could find a way to address the board? Because, you know, going to the meetings, annual meetings is not working. You know, putting their concerns in writing is not working. Trying to get other people elected is not working. They actually, a lot of the times they receive threats, death threats. They will threaten to turn off their lights. They get a lot of pushback and retaliation when they try to hold the electric cooperative accountable. What type of advice? It can be as a board of director member or not. Just some type of light at the end of the tunnel for these people, for everyone fighting this fight in the South.
I wish I had a magic bullet for you. I really do. I think a lot of it. What you're talking about to me and my experience on my board is so foreign that it's hard for me to really, you know, add any additional, you know, tools to your bucket than what you're already doing. I wish I could tell you something different on that. But I think that there's more and more of us that are pulling together. We're pulling from you in Mississippi and us in Colorado and Seth in Virginia and the iron is hot right now. It's hot on a lot of levels. And so we just continue to keep pushing and pulling in the direction that is going to, you know, making our cooperative communities and our communities as a whole much stronger and healthier and more resilient.
Yes. Yes. Thank you so much.
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, that was a tough one, Benita, but thanks, Holly, for taking that.
I'll just, Kim Alexander in Iowa had a question for Holly, which is, tell us what you did to when you ran for board, and how were you able to win? And I forget, Holly, did you say you do not have proxies there? You have direct voting?
It's all direct voting, sir. Even if there's 2 people on an account, only whoever signs it and sends that sucker in first is the vote. So as far as my campaign, you know, I was fortunate, like Liz mentioned earlier, I worked with We Own It and started learning some community organizing tactics. And I knew that my board seat was going to be completely available. So I did start looking at it because it's a big decision. It's a big decision to run for a seat like this because you're making really important decisions that are going to last decades. So I really evaluated hard, you know, whether I had, you know, the capacity to be able to run or not. And so I personally went to all the board meetings before I even signed up, and I met with people who had been on the board of directors for LPEA. I did a wide variety of things to kind of gear up and think about it. And about the time I was making a decision, I had some lovely ladies materialize out of the woodwork who wanted to support my run. And they started building out my organizing campaign and supplied, you know, assistance on how to do door hangers, or do I do mailings, or, you know, what are the financials, because there's a lot of steps to it and it's expensive. Sending out a mailing is expensive. So, you know, I was really super excited to have some support of some really great folks along the way. Some support from folks that I had met at We Own It. And, you know, I just went for it. And I knocked on a lot of doors. I can tell you that I did knock on a lot of doors. And that for me was part of the fun part, because I got to talk to the people and find out what they really needed and wanted.
Cool. I think that's probably a good question to end on, unless you all have something else you want to add. Awesome. Well, I feel like all of our panelists were really amazing, and we had really great questions and engagement in the chat and the Q&A. So thanks everyone here for all of your questions and everything. And I will again put stuff in the chat around our campaign and how you can get involved, and hope people can connect to that work, particularly if you're in Virginia, and or if you know people in Virginia who may be able to get involved. I think that's it, unless any of our panelists want to say any last words.
To say thank you to everyone for the good questions and for listening in.
And Liz, we'll be sending out a recording to all attendees and RSVPs, correct?
Yeah, thanks, Aaron. I'll send out the recording and some of the links and information so that everybody has that as a follow-up.
And I just want to say this one thing. I always like to say this when I'm talking about electric cooperatives. My grandfather passed away about 5 years ago. He was in World War II. He was on the D-Day invasion on Normandy Beach. He got shot and he passed away. He was a member owner of Magnolia Electric Power Association during a time where he could not vote because of the color of his skin. One of my biggest regrets is not being able to tell him that he was a member owner of his electric cooperative. He passed away before I really got my passion and my knowledge around this topic in this area. So that is like one of my biggest regrets, is not being able to tell my grandfather this information. So I do everything I can to share this with any and everybody. I'm like, oh, you're not a member owner? That's fine. Tell your cousin, tell your friend, write it in a birthday card, put it in a Christmas gift, tell everybody so they can tell their friends too. So just spread the knowledge. It is so very important.
Thanks for that, Benita. Thanks, everybody.
Night.